I'm Paul Edwards. I'm the author of the Mourner's Woods books, and first and foremost, a monster kid. Tonight I'm watching Voyage into Space from 1970. Some of you may be familiar with the contents of this movie, even if you've never seen the movie, and here's why. In 1967, there was a Japanese TV show, Johnny Sokko and His Flying Robot. This was a live-action show. And the premise of this show was that a little boy named Johnny Sokko, through a series of events, he became the only person who could control a gigantic warrior robot by means of voice control. He spoke to the robot through a wristwatch. And he was responsible for defending the Earth through this robot from a series of increasingly preposterous monsters that was sent by the Emperor Guillotine from outer space. This TV show was a big hit in Japan, and it was dubbed into English and released in some television markets on UHF stations here in America. Some. Not a lot. And unfortunately, not in my TV market, which was Boston, Massachusetts. But all hope was not lost. For those of us who didn't have the TV series, Johnny Sokko and His Flying Robot, we had an adaptation of it. What they did was they took several episodes of the TV show, Johnny Sokko and His Flying Robot, and edited them together to create a movie that was about 90 minutes. And they named the movie Voyage into Space, even though the only time anybody goes into space is at the very end of the film. Why they didn't call the movie Johnny Sokko and His Flying Robot, I don't know. So as a kid growing up, this was the only Johnny Sokko and His Flying Robot that I knew, the movie version. And in the movie, of course, they had to adapt the first episode where Johnny gets control of the giant robot through a series of mishaps. And of course, they had to include the final episode where the robot goes up against Emperor Guillotine himself. But choosing which episodes from the middle of the series to include in the intermediate part of the movie probably was difficult because there were a lot of wild episodes to choose from. So this little boy, Johnny Sokko, because he has control of the robot, becomes a secret agent. He's incorporated into a Unicorn, a worldwide secret security agency, which is tasked with fighting Emperor Guillotine and his hordes of bizarre monsters called the Gargoyle Gang. Now, as a kid watching this, I didn't think, wow, wouldn't it be great if I was a secret agent like Johnny Sokko? Even as a kid, my thought was, why are they letting a kid be a secret agent? You know, all I could think of was, if you remember the TV show Get Smart in the 1960s, which was a spoof of James Bond and other spy properties. Remember Secret Agent 8.5? There was a little boy, Control Agent 8.5, and, you know, they would just have a little boy who was a kid come out and say secret agent lines and smack his bubblegum and roller skate away. Well, that's what Johnny Sokko made me think of. Secret Agent 8.5. So Johnny Sokko, though, would have to pit his robot against a whole bunch of bizarre monsters. And I don't know where they kept coming up with the ideas for these monsters. They were somewhat like Power Ranger monsters, except a little bit less goofy, but just as far out. For instance, there was one monster that was just a gigantic eyeball. And there were ganglia hanging off of the eyeball like strings hanging off a balloon. And that was the whole monster. And it would float around. This gigantic eyeball would float around, terrorizing the countryside. They had a monster that could lay down on a train track, open its mouth, and the whole train would go into its mouth, and then it would stand up and swallow the train and walk away. They had sea monsters. They had a plant monster called the Gargoyle Vine, which actually came back twice. And it was probably difficult for them to choose which monsters to include in this compilation movie. Oddly, they did include the Gargoyle Vine, but they included the second time that the Gargoyle Vine had appeared. So there's dialogue right in the film with everybody saying, well, you remember the last time we beat the gargoyle vine? And you're like, what? What are you talking about? Of course, now I know that there were other episodes that had gone before that. But as a kid, I had no idea this movie had come from a TV show. All I knew was this was a movie. So that line made no sense to me. But if you're looking for Johnny Sokko and his flying robot to make sense, I don't know what to tell you. The robot was awesome. I just loved Giant Robot. And yes, I know it's not a very creative name that he's called Giant Robot. But remember Lost in Space, the original Lost in Space? What was the robot's name? That's right, Robot. And he was cool, wasn't he? So yes, Giant Robot was the name of Johnny Sokko's Giant Robot. And he had a never-ending supply of different weapons, and somehow Johnny always knew what they were. You know, he had a mega punch and a rocket punch and a super missile and a mega missile, and Johnny would just say these combinations of words, and the robot would come up with something new every time. Johnny was never given a handbook for how the robot operated, so I don't know how he learned all this, but okay. It was pretty awesome to watch. So that was how I came to know of Johnny Sokko and his flying robot. Now, if you were lucky enough to have grown up in a market where they were showing the series Johnny Sokko and his flying robot on TV in the 1970s, you got to see a lot more Johnny Sokko than I did. There was no original footage shot for this movie, Voyage into Space. So it's not like we got to see something that you didn't. If you saw the TV series, you saw everything that is in the movie. But we were happy just to see the movie. Now, I'll tell you something funny that has happened since then. Starting in the 90s and into the 2000s, there were a couple of different spots online where I would be on these Creature Double Feature discussion boards, for those of us who remember Creature Double Feature and old monster movies in general. And we would be talking about, you know, which ones we liked and so forth. And like every 3 days, somebody would show up that was new on the board, and they'd say, hey, maybe one of you guys would know. There was a movie I remember where a little boy controlled a robot from his wristwatch. And then like 8 of us would all post Voyage into Space, because it just came up so often. It was so vividly remembered. The title was not vividly remembered because the title doesn't match the movie at all, Voyage into Space. But the movie was very vividly remembered and fondly remembered by a whole generation of monster kids. Listen, if you enjoy vintage monster movies, check out my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. They're available on Amazon.com. I capture the feeling and the vibe of 20th century monster movies in written form, set in a contemporary setting. And I have different monsters in different books, and I never repeat characters from one book to another, so you'll never know who's going to survive from the beginning of the story to the end, because nobody comes back in the next book. So my name again is Paul Edwards. My books are the Mourner's Woods books. They're available on Amazon.com. Thanks for reminiscing with me about Johnny Sokko and his flying robot. I'll see you in Mourner's Woods.